Well, welcome back to our weekly talks. We are in the book by Brené Brown, Dare to Lead, which is just fantastic. We were just commenting how much we love highlighting. She's got a lot of quotable quotes. But we are in the rumbling with vulnerability part, and we are in section 2 of rumbling with vulnerability, which is the call to courage. And she says to clear is kind and unclear is unkind. And I love her story right in the beginning, of course, which is basically like the people she's working with sit her down, and she's thinking she's about to have an intervention, and she's the how do you say it, interventee.
Yes.
But then what does she say about it? I'll let you go ahead and respond with that. There's a great section on that we've just talked about.
Well, yeah, she goes on to say that she went home, I think it was that night, and tried to become an expert in time management, because she said when her team brought this to her attention, she was aware this was not the first time that somebody had done this. And she immediately pictured a time with her husband and apparently there have been many times. So anyway, she decided she was going to become an expert in time management, and basically realized that just wasn't going to happen. And it reminds me of what, Nathan, you've been leading our staff through with the Clifton Strengths, and what I heard years ago from Marcus Buckingham. When we identify what our strengths are, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to spend the majority of our time working on our weaknesses when we have somebody often sitting on our team or in the room, or a spouse or a friend or what have you, business partner, who has that strength already naturally. And research shows we really won't grow much in the area of our weakness anyway. But with that said, she says feeding people truths to make them feel better, which is almost always about making ourselves feel more comfortable, is unkind.
Right.
Not getting clear with a colleague about your expectations because it feels too hard, yet holding them accountable or blaming them for not delivering is unkind. Talking about people rather than to them is unkind.
Yeah.
And she goes on to say, this lesson has so wildly transformed my life that we live by it at home. Clear
I
is
actually
kind.
I saw an interview by a woman who was I think the main editor of a magazine, and she said, my rule is to always be quick with feedback, whether it's positive or negative, because it lets people know where they stand very quickly. So if it's positive, they get the reinforcement immediately, and if it's negative, it's easier to move to the next step quicker when you've gotten the feedback. When they don't get feedback, things are left in this unknowing and this uncertainty phase, and it breeds a lot of negative things, and it's unproductive as well. So I just thought it was really interesting that leader took that stance as well, because she said, it's not helpful to me and it's not helpful to you if I don't give you the feedback that I really have. Because like Brené is saying, half truth, it was sort of like, well, maybe then that person is picking up on your maybe ambivalence or ambiguity, and even that can kind of lead us to fill in the gaps, which are usually not good.
That's right. It's been said many times, I think this is relevant, the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference.
Yeah.
Have you heard that? So when we feel something that we have an opinion on that somebody else has said or done, and we keep it to ourselves, at least with me, I'm certainly not coming across as happy in that moment. I probably come across as indifferent in an effort to try and hide my fear of what you'll think about me if I actually share what I'm thinking about you.
Hey guys, this was totally not on purpose and real vulnerability here. My laptop died, and I had to get a different device so we could continue our conversation. So, but that wasn't planned. But it works out well in this particular instance. So
Yes, it does.
we were talking. Well, I'm going to let you finish off your thought because I
have
suppose
no
it was
idea what
me that
that thought
interrupted.
was. I thought you just got tired of doing the video and you jumped out.
I will say though that we were going to talk about fear and what the emotions that drive us to self-protect,
Yes.
to assemble our armor. And I know that that was a big highlight for us, and we wanted to go through that. So why don't you lead us off with that?
Well, speaking of fear, I wanted to read from this paragraph. She says, concerning her team confronting her weakness. She said how that was such a powerful experience for her. And basically, she didn't want to share or embrace the fear that she had, because behind that fear was this question: what if the scarcity and anxiety are happening because I have no business being a leader? Even being honest about my failure to communicate larger strategy was daunting. What if my communication fails are just symptomatic of my being in over my head trying to run businesses?
Mm-hmm.
And she said how shame, she goes on to talk about how shame crept in. And she had this thought: you don't belong in this job. You study leadership, but you can't lead. You're a joke. And we've talked about shame a number of times. And this is something that is a reality for all of us.
Right.
Fear creeps in and it leads to shame. And she gets into some of the things that we say to ourselves. She says, when we're in fear or an emotion is driving self-protection, there's a fairly predictable pattern of how we assemble our armor piece by piece. Do you want to take a look at some of those?
I mean, we're talking about shame, and I'm pretty sure number one is the shame statement, which is simply, I'm not enough. Meaning, I'm not enough to be a good leader. I'm not enough to be a good communicator. I'm not enough. Pick the ending. It is the first involuntary instinct, I think, that we'll go to when we are in fear or we're driven to be in the self-protection mode.
Yes. The next one is, if I'm honest with people about what's happening, they'll think less of me or maybe even use it against me. And you and I have talked about this, like, as I'm looking at here on my desk, some of my Clifton strengths, some of the ones at the bottom, I'm thinking to myself, that should not be on the bottom of a pastor's list. And where did that come from? And yet, thankfully, you are on my what you call it, square list.
Yeah, that's right.
And I was able to share Square Squad. I was able to share with you, like, what the heck, what's going on here? So, and you were able to talk me down. But we do have a fear, if we're honest about what's happening, that people might think less of us. So that's the second one. So and then the third one is, go ahead.
So, of course, I'm not going to be honest because no one else is doing it. So why should I do it? I mean, we're telling ourselves this. And I think it's funny because, she is saying that courage is courageous. She's saying that that to be vulnerable is how we even develop our courage. And so someone needs to make that choice. Unfortunately, that's the hard part about a group, is that one person does need to step up and say, I'm going to show courage, because in fact, it has a multiplying effect. Others will now feel the maybe permission or simply the courage to be courageous, whichever it is. But it does start with one person.
Yeah. I bet we've probably all been in a scenario where somebody in the group has been courageous and been appropriately vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And I can picture that scene right now, and I know how I feel. I almost feel empowered, and it gives me courage to want to be vulnerable as well. So it is contagious. And then she said, but the next step in that cycle is basically, well, forget about people. I don't see them being honest about what scares them, and they have plenty of issues. So I'm not going to be honest either.
I love the turn of direction. I mean, she says, "Screw them," and
Yes.
say, "I'm going to throw my shame across the fence and let them deal."
That's right.
Terrible cycles, though, isn't it?
Well, and it leads to the next one, right? You come. This is so true. I think at least it is for me. The next thought
Yeah,
is, well, it's actually their issue and their shortcoming that makes me act the way that I do. This is their fault, and they're trying
this
to
is
blame
their
me.
fault. So it's not fault. All the things I'm saying, it's actually their fault. And then the natural one at the end is, in fact, now that it makes me laugh. Now that
It
I think
does.
about it, I am actually better than them. I mean, you can just hear the circles working. And unfortunately, it's all on the shaky ground, which is still the first one, which is shame, and fear, which keeps us from being courageous. And you can already see in these steps, there's the self disconnection, and then there's the group disconnection. Like, okay, well, I'm going to violently disconnect from other people here, and now I'm going to start lobbing some rocks over. I mean, it's terrible. I'm laughing because it's kind of I suppose because I can relate to it, and I've seen and felt so much disaster in my own life, and so laughter is
Yes,
a good healing tool. So
indeed. That is what the Bible says. She goes on to quote a guy named Joseph Campbell, who was actually consulted
yeah.
or consulted with George Lucas in writing Star Wars. But the quote she uses, and she goes into a scene from Star Wars: "The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek."
Mm-hmm. He
And
actually,
in
yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
Joseph Campbell wrote actually a pretty famous book. It's something called like the face of a thousand heroes or something like that. And it's the proverbial story path that
Mm,
Lucas actually used for Star Wars. And I think it's great because it's really exemplifying, in every movie that has a hero, we do want to see that courageous moment, and I'm gonna enter that cave because that's actually where the truth lies. I mean, she
mm.
even says feelings are okay. That's the path that we go to. What does she say in one of those sections? What stands in the way ends up being the way
Yes,
forward. So
yes, that's right.
yeah.
And then she asks the very convicting question in a section that she calls treasure hunting: "What is the cave I fear to
Hmm.
enter?" What's the cave I
Yeah.
fear to enter?
I think that's the powerful one because the answer that I think is rumbling in people's minds is not vulnerability, but like, I want to get stronger. And they're really, what they're facing is more the negative side of things. They're not facing necessarily the answers they're seeking, uh, which is connection, which is beautiful vulnerability, which is a square squad, which is right.
Yes.
Um, and to grasp upon those treasures that we really are hungry for and we're seeking after, I think is what gives us, in fact, she calls them permission, but but the permission that we need to go ahead and dare greatly, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So anyway,
she gets into the tool of permission slips, which is basically, she uses this, I believe, with her team. It's the idea of writing down before a meeting, I give myself permission to, and then fill in the blank. And she says there's something very powerful about giving yourself permission to dare greatly, even in the context of one meeting.
Yeah.
So this is a great section.
Yeah. There's so many other parts to it that are so beautiful and good to look at.
And she wraps up the section by she talks about serving other people. In fact, the last sentence in the chapter, last two, daring leadership is ultimately about serving other people, not ourselves. That's why we choose courage. And of course, that's in the context of saying difficult things and giving feedback.
Right.
And that's one way that we can serve other people. And that's why we choose courage. Great section. Really encourage you to pick up the book from Brené Brown called Dare to Lead. Thanks for hanging in there with us. This has been fun.
Yeah. Thanks for letting me hang in a second time. So
absolutely. All right. We will see you next time.
See you guys.